In the world of AKs, there are going to be two major types that people recognize and identify, and they're going to be the stamp style of AK and then the original milled style of AK, or semi-original milled style of AK. So we already took a look at a couple of stamped AKs, those being my Arsenal SLR-107FR, as well as my PSA Krinkov, but today we're going to be taking a look at the other side of the spectrum with a milled gun, and this is going to be an Arsenal SAM5 chambered in 5.56 NATO. Now, I already went pretty in-depth into the history and the development of the AK series in my SLR-107FR video, so we're not going to get too deep into it, but we are going to hit some of the cliff notes. So, of course, that original AK design that Kalashnikov came up with back in the late 1940s was actually a stamped receiver gun, and that was considered the Type 1 receiver. Now, during the production of the gun, they actually ran into some pretty major issues with the actual production and building of them. And they had a lot of QC issues. The majority of the receivers, like over 50% essentially, were rejected when they were inspected and before they actually went into service. So, of course, that's a major issue. And stamping is still fairly new to the Soviets. They had been doing stampings for, say, simple submachine guns like the PPS-43 or PPS-H, but these are more complex stampings that were more difficult to actually do and refine. And with the issues that they were having with the early ones, they decided to go back to a more tried and true technology for the Soviets, which is going to be milling. And with the AK, there are two different types of major variants of milled receiver. You have the original Type 2 receiver, which was back in the early 1950s-ish to around 1957. Those were in production. And the big difference with the milled receiver, the early Type 2, is going to be they had a socket on the stock, so your stock would actually insert into the socket to attach to the receiver. And then the milling on the side of the receiver, these lightning cuts here, was also a little bit different. It was going to be parallel with the bolt instead of the bottom of the receiver. The Type 3 made those changes to there, as well as some more production style of changes, and this was the design that they more or less ended up on for the early AK-47s. Now, speaking about stamp versus milled, there are some definite things that you have to consider there. So, of course, milling is going to be generally more expensive because you're going to start off with a solid block of steel, and they essentially remove material until you end up with a finished receiver. Versus stamping, where you have a flat piece of sheet steel which they cut holes into, and then they bend it into the shape of the receiver, and then they're going to essentially rivet on a front and rear trunnion and spot weld rails onto the inside of the receiver to get essentially the same design that you get with a milled receiver. However, they're actually going to be using less material with that stamp design. So the milled receivers are going to be heavier by actually quite a fair degree, over a pound heavier in most cases. And they are going to be higher quality overall just because of that milling process is going to take more time and attention to detail versus a stamping. But there are some other considerations there too with the longevity of the rifle, where you have some advantages with the stamping, because if you have an issue with the receiver on a milled gun, you basically have to scrap the entire receiver, throw it away, and start with a new receiver. Versus a stamp gun, if you have an issue with, say, the front trunnion, what you can do is pop the rivets, take out that front trunnion, and then just put a new front trunnion in there. You can save the rear trunnion, you can save the stamped steel receiver, all the other stuff you can still reuse. But with the milled design, if there's an issue, you basically have to throw the whole thing out. Now, the milled receivers are going to be a little bit more rigid than those stamp receivers. So you'll see it often quoted in the AK world. The AK-47 with a milled receiver is going to be more accurate than a stamped AK. Does that really play out in reality? Honestly, I think it's still kind of up to be seen, but you should get a little bit more rigidity out of the milled receivers. The milled receivers are also a good deal smoother feeling than the stamped counterparts, because they're not going from one rail, which is spot welded to the side of the receiver, to another. It just seems like the tolerances are a little bit tighter, so you can really feel it when you actually go to charge it. Now, the milled receiver guns were actually really just a stopgap for the Soviets between the original Type 1 style of stamped receiver, which had major issues, and the eventual Type 4 or AKM style receiver. So throughout the 1950s, they were still working on refining their stamping technology and designs, and eventually they came out with that Type 4 receiver, which had major improvements as far as their ability to QC it, the rigidity of the receiver over that original Type 1, and very quickly phased out the Type 2 and the Type 3 milled receivers because there were some advantages for the stamped ones. The biggest advantages of the stamped steel receivers is the ability to make them a lot faster and a lot easier than a milled receiver. They take a lot less man hours to actually be able to produce them. So that's one of the main reasons they went to them. It's also easier for the Soviets to help other countries tool up to make an AKM versus an AK-47 because it doesn't require nearly the same amount of tools to do. And it also takes less high quality steel to make a stamped gun. One other improvement going from that milled gun to the stamped AKM is going to be the way that the barrel actually mounts to the receiver. So the original Type 2 and Type 3 receivers had a barrel which screwed into the trunnion, which is a little bit of an older style of design. It's more difficult to get a head spacing on it, versus the AKM, which had a pressed and pin style of barrel, which is easier to do. You basically press in the barrel, you move it until you have the correct head spacing, and then you drill and pin it in place, which is a lot easier. It's also easier if the barrel gets shot out or has issues to replace the barrel on an AKM style of trunnion where you just press it in. Now, while a lot of countries over the years have produced their own indigenous AK style designs, the vast majority of them were not milled receivers. They were the stamp receiver guns. And only a couple of countries actually started building the milled receivers, and those are going to be China. So back in the 1950s, they actually had pretty good relations with the Soviets, and they had that technology transfer, and the early Type 56s were milled guns. Eventually, they would move to stamp guns, and those would actually be kind of a hybrid between the Type 3 milled guns and the Type 4 AKM series. But you also had Poland, you had North Korea, you had Hungary, as well as Yugoslavia, and Finland actually produced the Valmet, the RK62, which is kind of their rendition on a milled AK, which they also eventually moved to stamping as well. And then one country that stuck with it for years and years is actually going to be Israel with the Galil, which is really kind of an AK variant, and it does use a milled style of receiver. Now, the final country that we're going to talk about is Bulgaria. And of course, the Arsenal SAM5 is a Bulgarian-made rifle. Now, the Bulgarians did originally take that Type 3 design and manufacture it. They were one of the few countries to do so. And they really love that kind of technology, and they stuck with it over the decades. And to this day, they're still making primarily milled receivers. And I don't even think they're still making stamp receiver guns, because this is really their signature feature on these. Now, they did update their receiver design over the years, though, from that original Type 3 with the screw and barrel to incorporate some AKM features. So they moved from, again, that screw and barrel to a pressed and pin style of AKM style barrel. And then they also updated the gas block from that original slanted style to a 90-degree gas block. They also changed the way that the vents work on the gas system so that they're up at the gas block instead of back on the gas tube. Arsenal is also very vocal and very proud about the way they make their milled receivers using a hot die forging process. So, of course, before you can mill out the receiver, you actually need to get that steel blank, and those are going to be forged. So they're going to essentially beat them into shape using hammers to get the grain structure of the steel the way that they want it to be. The original way that the Soviets did it would be kind of a cold hammer forging way to a degree. So not a metallurgical engineer, so I don't know exactly how much that's going to impact the quality of the end product, but they are very proud of them. And they'll even admit that it takes about 5.5 hours of milling after they actually beat it into shape to get the end product. So it takes a lot of time to make one of these receivers. All right, and that's going to do it for the history portion of the video. So let's go ahead and get into the review. And real quick, big shout out to the Echo Valley Training Center in Cape on Hill, West Virginia, where I've shot this rifle and a bunch of other ones over the years, so check them out if you're in the DC area. And also, if you want to check out my Patreon and help with ammo costs, I would appreciate it. First up is accuracy, where the SAM5 is going to get a 3. At 100 yards with 55 grain M193 ammunition, I was able to get about a 3.3 MOA group with the SAM5. Now compare that to the SLR 107FR, which got about a 3.6 MOA group. You can see it's a slightly more accurate rifle. Now I will say that my SLR is a 7.62 by 39 millimeter gun versus 5.56. 5.56 is generally going to be more accurate, so that could definitely account for the difference. I wouldn't necessarily say that milled is 100% going to be more accurate than stamped, but I did get better results. Next up is Aftermarket, where the SAM5 is going to get a 4. Now there is a bit of parts commonality with your typical stamped AKs, and that's going to be in parts like your grip, your top cover. The side rail on here is going to be compatible with most of your different side rail mounts like RS Regulate. And then stuff like your trigger group are going to be interchangeable. The 14x1 left-hand threads, you can throw a lot of different muzzle devices on there. But there are going to be some differences with the milled gun, which is going to drop off a point, and that's going to be the stocks. So the milled receiver guns do use a specific pattern of stock, which frankly, there's not that many options out there to replace it with. The handguard for the milled guns is also going to be proprietary to it, and again, there's not going to be a ton of different options there. Midwest Industries' older style of universal handguards will fit on milled AKs, however their newer ones are not going to work on them and only work on stamp guns. RS Regulate does make M-LOK handguards for the SAM7 series, which will also fit on the SAM5, so that is a good option. SLR Rifle Works also makes different style of M-LOK handguards for milled AKs. When it comes to the stock though, you are severely limited on options on milled AKs, and part of that's due to the way it mounts. So there are actually two tangs on the receiver, one on top which is fairly short, and then a second tang on the bottom which is very long and has two screws in it. Both tangs are permanently attached to the receiver, so some stock modifications that you'll have to do requires you to remove that bottom tang, which generally I don't like to do on guns. A Ukrainian company, KPYK, actually makes a modern style of stock design for milled AKs. However, you do have to remove the tang to use that stock. Now, if you want to go with the classic wood style, there are actually quite a few different options. So on mine, I actually have wood furniture from APS Firearms, which turned out very, very nice. Looks great on this rifle. You also have different options from Comblock Customs as well as Ironwood Designs if you want to go the wood route with your rifle. When it comes to durability, no surprises here. The SAM5 is getting a full 5. It's an incredibly durable rifle. Starting out with the finish, it is the standard Arsenal paint over parkerizing finish, so it doesn't look the nicest. However, it is very durable overall, and even if the paint kind of flakes off in areas, it's got the parkerizing underneath, so it's still going to protect your rifle very well. Now, as far as the actual milling and construction of the SAM5, it is fantastic. It looks very clean. It feels incredibly smooth. It should be a very durable rifle. Now, one asterisk is that the SAM5s that came in the early 2020s had a very common issue with the gas port being too large for what it was designed to be. So they actually had it overboard with the carbine length barrel style of gas port, which would really pump up the bolt velocity on this guy and make it essentially beat the receiver to death eventually, or the bolt or something like that. So that is an issue to be aware of, and if you can tell your SAM5 is very overgassed, I would contact Arsenal and see what they can do about it. So that is a known issue that has popped up in the past. Mine is absolutely perfectly gassed for an AK, so it's going to be a little bit overgassed. But yeah, that's something to keep in mind. When it comes to ergonomics, the Arsenal SAM5 is going to get my standard AK score of 2. Now, starting off with the controls, up at the front, of course, we don't have an adjustable gas plug, so there's nothing really to do up here. But coming back, our charging handle is just going to be on the right side of the rifle, and it does reciprocate, so not a huge issue there, but as far as ergonomically charging this thing, it is going to be a bit difficult compared to some more modern designs, especially as a righty. You have to come around underneath, something like that, to actually charge it. Now, the safety selector is my biggest complaint on any AK, so it's going to be on just the right side of the receiver out here up front and doubles as your dust cover here to cover up this port into the receiver. And again, it's not super ergonomic. You can take your shooting hand and kind of sweep it off that way, but it's not going to be nearly as nice as Western designs. Now, our charging handle is, again, very, very smooth here with this milled receiver AK compared to a stamp gun. Now for the mag release, it's going to be AK standard, just a paddle underneath, rock and lock style magazine, so not terrible, but still not the best design overall. And there's really nothing else to go over on the AK here. It does have a little trapdoor in the back for a cleaning kit. I don't have one in here now, but that is an option. When it comes to maintenance, I'm going to give the SAM5 a 4. And as far as disassembly goes, it's entirely the same as any stamped AK out there. So you take off your top cover, take out your springs, all that fun stuff. It's all going to be the same. Getting into the receiver and cleaning it out is going to be essentially the same as a stamp gun. It's not really that much tighter or anything like that. And then getting into your gas system again is going to be exactly the same as a stamp gun. So overall, it's not bad to maintain. And again, being an AK, this thing can go for quite a while without cleaning, and it'll get pretty filthy in there and really just keep going. So as far as maintenance goes, it's pretty good. And then for replacing parts on it, replacing parts on AKs can be a bit of a pain, because if you get, say, a replacement bolt, it has to be headspace to the receiver. So you have to check your headspace, do all of that, which is going to be kind of a pain in the butt. When it comes to modularity, I'm giving the SAM5 a 3. Now, AKs in general are not going to be the most modular platforms out there, of course, since they're designed back in the 1940s. So there are some things you can change out, like the stock, the handguard, and pistol grip, trigger group, all that stuff. So there is some modularity to the system. Again, you're limited on the milled guns as far as your stocks and your handguards go. But then you're not going to be swapping barrels, calibers, anything like that with an AK. That is a more complicated process than it is on something like an AR-15, so you are fairly limited in its modularity. When it comes to price, the SAM5 is going to get a 3, coming in around $1,800. So these are considered higher quality AKs, so they are going to be more expensive than some of your cheaper options out there, like Zastava, WBP Fox, something like that. When it comes to shooting characteristics, I'm going to give the SAM5 a 4. And starting off with the trigger, I've always been a big fan of AK triggers. They tend to be very, very nice. This one comes in at about 4 pounds. It has a very, very nice clean feel and a crisp break, so I have no complaints about this trigger. When it comes to recoil, it's actually not bad on the SAM5. So mine is actually pretty well gassed. It's not incredibly overgassed like some AKs are, so it doesn't have a ton of recoil to it. Also, being in 5.56, this is going to have considerably less recoil than a 7.62x39 AK. And being a milled gun, it's also going to be heavier than a stamp gun, so that's also going to soak up more of that recoil. So it's really not bad on the SAM5. Now, as you can see, I do have a chemo muzzle device on this guy, so I do suppress it, and I've only been suppressing it with my B&T SRBS 7.62, which is a flow-through lower back pressure style of suppressor. And with that can on there, it actually runs incredibly nice. I don't notice a huge jump in the bolt velocity. It sounds fairly good overall. You do get a good amount of port pop on AKs though. They are not generally the best suppressor hosts, but it actually smooths it out too, and it makes the recoil feel even nicer than it does without a can on it. In terms of reliability, there's no surprises here. The SAM5 is going to get a full 5. And I've never had a malfunction with this. I've used it at a match before, and it was 100% the entire time. And one thing with 5.56 AKs is they're kind of limited on your mag options, and that's been getting a lot better over the last couple of years. You have the original, the Circle 10 mags that come with these guys, a waffle style of magazine, which is incredibly nice, very expensive though. And then you also have different options to convert a 5.45 magazine, like this Red Russian Bakelite magazine, to 5.56 with the upgraded follower from Pod Arms. And then they also have 5.56 magazines coming in on Gun Mag Warehouse from Bulgaria. They're commercial magazines, which have been very, very nice for me. I have the ones with steel inserts in them, and they worked 100% in this guy. And then I also have used an FB Radom magazine, one of their blue ones in this, and again, no issues whatsoever. When it comes to weight, the SAM5 is going to get a 2, and that's going to be an issue with the milled AKs because they are fairly heavy. Mine comes in at 8.5 pounds without anything on it, just as you see it here. So it is going to be heavier than a stamp gun and a lot of the other options on the market. And when we go ahead and add up all 10 categories, we're going to come out with a score of 35 for the SAM5, which is going to put it up into the A tier. And when it comes to the positives for the SAM5, there's not really going to be any surprises here, being it's a very, very nice AK. The durability is second to none, absolutely fantastic. This thing is a tank. The maintenance isn't too bad on it, and the shooting characteristics for the 5.56 AK is actually very, very nice. And finally, of course, reliability on the AK is fantastic. I've never had an issue with this rifle. Now, there are some pretty major downsides to the SAM5. The first being ergonomics on an AK are not the best. They are very, very dated. The accuracy on this guy is also not as good as some other options out there, some more modern ones. It's not the most modular rifle in the world. It's actually also fairly expensive. And again, being a milled AK, it's going to be fairly heavy as well. And as far as the cool factor goes, I'm going to throw it right up into the A tier with its stamp brother because, of course, it's an AK. It's ubiquitous. It's in all sorts of places all across the world. It's the #1 most produced rifle in the world. And essentially, coolness-wise, I think the milled guns are just as cool as the stamp guns, and they're not necessarily cooler than each other. Now, as far as movies go, of course, AKs pop up in pretty much any movie that you're going to name. It's going to be in anything to do with the Soviet Union, you know, post-World War II, obviously. Anything with the global war on terror in the Middle East, even Vietnam, it's going to have some AK variant in it. Whether it's a stamped or a milled gun, they're going to look essentially the same. Video games, again, it's the most produced rifle in history, so it's going to be in most video games that are in the Cold War era all the way up to modern games. So all of the Call of Duty series games that are in a modern time are going to have some AK variant in it. All the Battlefield games, Rainbow Six, what have you, there's going to be an AK in that game. Alright guys, and that's going to do it for my review on the Arsenal SAM5. So thank you for checking out the video. Please like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff, and I'll see you in the next one.